Hi, everybody. Justin Magill. On Common Sense of the Patriots, I like to talk a lot about what the founders did when they created this country, when they created the U.S. Constitution, when they created the state constitutions, and why they set it up the way they did. I always recommend that people read for themselves, study for themselves. Don't take anybody's word for it, mine included. Um, if you ever want references for anything that I'm discussing, anything that you're interested in discussing, I'm more than happy to provide those. Uh, but definitely, I want everybody reading about the common sense of the Patriots when forming this country. And so I have a few books here that I want to recommend. I want to get people thinking about, reading about. Um, First and foremost, read your Constitution. There's lots of easy, small pamphlets to get a hold of for the U.S. Constitution. Every state's constitution is widely available. Um, for Pennsylvania, I've printed off all of our constitutions from the beginning of this state as an independent state all the way up through to the current one. I go through and I highlight sections that I find interesting. I make notes. It's fascinating to see what they started with and why. It's fascinating to see the changes that were made from before the Constitution of the U.S. to after it was ratified. And it's interesting to see the different changes that are made throughout the years. And always keep an eye on what history is doing at the time those changes are made. It gives you a lot of insight there. When it comes to understanding the Constitution, it's not a mystery. A lot of people seem to think that it's very mysterious. There's a lot of undefined terms in there. It's really not that difficult. A lot of great resources out there. There's different notes that were written during the federal convention that was creating the Constitution. So we see what the founders were thinking and discussing and the directions they were coming from. Max Ferrand here has an excellent set that I highly recommend. He has a lot of extra stuff that he adds in there, a lot of references. When you read these, it's important to understand what state they're coming from. It's important to understand what the history is of that state. And it's important to try to get a feel for what idea of government the particular founder had in mind. So there's some founders that were more interested in having a national government where the states were subservient governments. There's others that were more of the extreme opposite of all the state governments are sovereign and they are confederating together on some very minor points. And there were even a few that wanted just open democracy. There are some that wanted a king and wanted a aristocracy and a House of Lords, if you will, and nothing else. They wanted them to rule supreme and everybody did what they told them to. So it's a good idea to get a little bit of history of where they're coming from. So there's all sorts of history books. This one's 1776 by David McCullough. It's excellent history there. There's a lot of biographies and autobiographies by the founders. A lot of great works out there. And again, I don't recommend you just read one. Read multiples because the authors of these various things are going to have different viewpoints. So you have an autobiography where an author has quite a elevated view of themselves, and then you have a biography by somebody else on that person that is less flattering. So if you read multiple sources, you get a more well-rounded picture of the founding fathers. And when I say the founding fathers, I don't just mean the people who signed the U.S. Constitution. I mean all of those who were involved in writing the U.S. Constitution, all of those who were involved in Continental Congress, all of those involved in the state congresses during this revolution, all of those involved in ratifying the Constitution, all of those writing back and forth with their thoughts and publishing things in the newspaper, they all had an impact on this. So definitely think a little more broad than just those who signed the Constitution. There were a number of delegates to the Constitutional Convention that didn't sign the Constitution itself. And some of them didn't sign because the directions they received when they were sent to this convention by their states, they felt did not did not allow them to sign the new document. It did far more than what the states had sent them there to do. So definitely keep a broader perspective on the founders than just those few names. When it comes to ratifying the Constitution, all of the states had conventions to discuss the pros and the cons on it. Most of them had their delegates up there giving speeches. So I think it's important to read those discussions from the states on the document that they were presented with. And Jonathan Elliott does a great job with these. He has the debates in the several state conventions. Again, it's a lot of speeches, it's a lot of discussions. And also there was a lot of pamphlets written during the time trying to encourage people either to vote for or to vote against ratifying this Constitution. So we had the Anti-Federalist Papers that were published in a newspaper in New York, trying to encourage the people of New York to reject the Constitution. They didn't feel like it protected states' sovereignty enough. They felt like it was going to become a national government where the states were just simply subservient governments. So they started publishing in the paper, in the newspaper, a lot of articles that argued against the Constitution. And there was several writers that took part in that. And then the Federalist Papers were the same New York newspaper, replies to the anti-Federalist articles. So it's a very fascinating thing to read through Anti-Federalist Paper 1 and Federalist Paper 1 and kind of see the balancing act going on. Here again, it's very important to understand the authors, where they're coming from, what their thoughts on government were, whether they were more a nationalist government, whether they were more for a confederation, where did they come from? And the Federalist Papers were written by Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay. Again, New Yorkers who were part of the convention trying to convince people to accept the Constitution. A lot of people like the Federalist Papers because not only were the writers of the Federalist Papers there at the writing of the U.S. Constitution and heard some of the arguments, but when New York ratified the U.S. Constitution, these guys were probably a strong part of that. So when we hear their arguments for what the Constitution limits, and these guys were a little bit more nationalist, a little more big government. So when we hear they think that government is limited by the Constitution in a certain way, we tend to think of that as a little more reliable than somebody who doesn't want any central government saying that the Constitution limits them. By the same token, you have the anti-federalists coming in and saying, this is a completely unlimited government. Look at all these things that they're letting themselves do. And they're saying that because they don't want a strong central government. But it's interesting to look and see how many of the claims that they made actually came true. How many of the things that they said the government was going to try to do, the central government, how many of those things have happened? So those are some good readings there, but there's also a lot of other writings that were going on at the time. Paul Ford has a collection of a lot of the writings going on at this time. This one's titled Pamphlets on the Constitution of the United States. And again, it's just a lot of writings of the individuals encouraging people to vote for ratification or to vote against ratification. So we have those writings going on at the time of the Constitution and the constitutional conventions. But it's important to look earlier than that in America. So we have all kinds of different writings at that period also. One of the more famous is Common Sense by Thomas Paine. He wrote a few different items throughout the Revolutionary period, as did a lot of others. If you look at the writings of the constitutions of the various states, Virginia ratified their constitution prior to the Declaration of Independence of the 13 states being written. So some of the writings from that time period bear important scrutiny because a lot of the composition of the Virginia Constitution, a lot of the idea of the rights of man played out throughout the number of years between the 1776 ratification of that Constitution and the writing of the U.S. Constitution. So it's important to look through those various writings at those times. It's also important to delve a little bit deeper into the writings of various philosophers that wrote on government. There's a lot of them that are kind of counterbalances. So one will write one thing and the other one will write in response to that. So John Locke's two treatises on government's a good one to read, but also you should read Hobbes' writings on government. It's kind of a balancing act back and forth through there. The Spirit of Laws by Montesquieu is a good one. This one really puts the idea of the purpose of laws over the individual or in favor of the individual into perspective. The Law of Nations is another good one to read that talks a little bit more about the natural progress of laws, and it's split up into monarchies, republics, and democracies. So it gives us a good picture of how each of those progress naturally and what's common amongst those types of governments, both within their government and also interacting with other governments. Excuse me. It's also important to delve into other works not necessarily related to government philosophy as far as the shaping of the government, but as in looking into other ideas like Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. So this is dealing with economics. It's important for government people to understand economics. So reading into some of this stuff is also enlightening into why the founders created our society the way they did. Now, we have a number of our founding fathers who were very highly educated, classically educated, we often call it, and they read a lot of things like Polybius, the history. So we've got Roman histories, you've got Cicero, Greek and Roman histories. It's important to understand not only concepts of government, but how those concepts have played out over time. Do we understand the Constitution of the Republic of Rome? Do we understand how their Senate worked in balance with the other parts of their government? And when you read the notes from the convention, you'll often see other governments and how they operated discussed there. From the Greek and the Roman all the way up through to their current governments in England and France and Spain, in the Germanic areas. These are often cited by the founding fathers, and if we don't know anything about those histories, we're often left in the dark wondering what they're talking about, especially if there's two sides to an argument. So there's some of these things that the founders say, this is how it is in the other government, and everybody else nods and says, yep, that's right. And there's other things that they say, this is how it is in this government, and somebody else stands up and says, that's not at all how it is. This is how it is. I know I was there, or I know I have friends there, and we're talking about this. So it's good to read your histories beyond just the American histories. It's good to study as broadly as you can so you can understand where the founders were coming from. You can understand the faults that they saw throughout history that they were trying to cure when they created our governments. It's also important to understand what was going on at the time of the American Revolution. One thing I was thinking about today, the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party came about because the British government said, we don't want everybody buying other people's tea. We want them to buy English tea. And so we're going to protect that by making a huge tax if they buy anybody else's tea and no tax if they buy English tea. Now, huge tax isn't really huge, but it was a tax. So it was a very protectionist tariff type of setup there. and the English people went on board and dumped this English tea into the harbor. And dumped the tea into the harbor to protest that tax, that protectionism of the government there. So again, that time period is important, but also moving forward, we need to understand how the founders' creation of our government should be impacted going forward. They gave us the ability to change our government as we see the need. So mid 1800s, socialism is becoming the big thing. We've got the Communist Manifesto is written. The socialism is being promoted all throughout Europe. And in 1850, we got Frederick Bastiat writing the law. And he reiterates a lot of what our founders discussed about we have these natural rights to life, liberty, and private property. Any laws created that violate those rights are tyrannical. So we need to understand how those things fit with the government that we created and understand why we created it the way we did, and understand if we need to make changes, what changes are those. So definitely don't just take somebody's word for any of this. Do some study on your own. I have an interest in a lot of these things. I enjoy reading biographies that some people might find dry. So it might come easier to me than to somebody else to do all of this. But definitely don't take anybody's word for it, not even mine. Dig in there and find the common sense of the Patriots. Thank you.